Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the panel discussion on scientific work with communities. And thank you for joining us for our last session of the day. It's been a really fantastic day so far, and I'm very excited for this last session. I think it's going to be a great discussion. So before we begin, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Melissa Jacart for all of her hard work putting together this fantastic event. And Melissa has been working tirelessly for essentially an entire year, I think maybe even longer, to make the workshop happen. And I think her dedication has really showed. So thank you, Melissa. And I also want to thank Angela Potocznik and the rest of the workshop team for all of their support along the way. They've done a really great job. And I think the discussions that we've had so far have been really fruitful and engaging, which has been really great to see. So my name is Amanda Kors. I'm going to be chairing today's session. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Minnesota, and I'm also a UC philosophy alum, so I'm very excited to be back and getting to chat with all of my people. So I'll first introduce our panelists, and we'll go right into questions from the audience from there, as this is a panel discussion. If you have a question for the panelists, please type it into the Zoom chat feature, and be sure to indicate who your question is directed to. So our panelists for our speakers for the panel discussion are Dr. Letitia A. Bates, Dr. Kenneth Petrin, and Dr. Carly Trott. Dr. Letitia A. Bates is Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence and Community Partnership, Associate Professor of Sociology, and a faculty affiliate of Africana Studies at the University of Cincinnati. She received an MA and PhD in Sociology from Arizona State University. Dr. Bates is a trained sociologist and demographer whose research focuses on institutional inequality. Broadly speaking, her research falls into four areas: sociology of education, sociology of family, stratification, and early childhood education. More specifically, her research focuses on the intersection of race and ethnicity and poverty on educational outcomes, and she's also interested in how family processes impact educational outcomes. Dr. Kenneth Petrin is the interim director of the UC Center for Field Studies and professor of biological sciences at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Petrin is an evolutionary ecologist who studies recent events at the interface of ecological and evolutionary time, and whose research projects include analysis of ancient DNA from historical museum specimens to reconstruct recent evolutionary changes in Galapagos finches, and revealing the potential for rapid evolution of invasive species as they spread across fragmented human landscapes. Dr. Carly Trott is a research psychologist and assistant professor of social and community psychology at the University of Cincinnati. And her research is driven by questions such as, what does the psychology of transformative social change look like? And what psychosocial and structural factors facilitate or impede processes of transformative social change? Dr. Trott's solidarity-driven research aims to bring visibility to and work against inequitable impacts of climate change socially and geographically. Her work draws upon theories within and beyond psychology, such as social movement, feminist, and empowerment theories, employs engaged research methods, and aims to advance social justice and environmental sustainability. So to start the session off, I'd like to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about your work and your experience working directly with communities. So maybe Dr. Bates, could you start us off?
Thank you so much, Amanda. I feel super excited to be here today. So thank Melissa and Angela as well, and both Ken and Carly for being here with us today. So the vast majority of my work dealing specifically with communities comes in sort of two forms. One, in my identity as a researcher, that's much more focused on not necessarily collecting data on communities, but with communities, thinking about my qualitative methods that I employ in the field. To really understand, in particular, parents' understanding of their school systems that they send their children to. So that's sort of one aspect of it. The other aspect is another thing that I think was mentioned at some point, either today or the other day, is the Cincinnati Project. I also sit on the leadership team of the Cincinnati Project and am heavily involved and have been since its inception. And so a number of the projects that we work through the Cincinnati Project and our symposiums and things that we organize, I've been involved with.
Great, thank you. Dr. Trott?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for being here, especially on a on a Friday afternoon. I'm also very excited to be here and to talk about community work. So my background is in psychology. So I did my master's and PhD in applied social psychology. I teach courses at UC in community engaged research to undergraduates as well as graduate students. And the way I approach my work, and again, my work deals with advancing sustainability, dealing with climate change, things like that, but from a social science perspective. So what I like to do in my research is use participatory and action research methods. So like Letitia was saying, I like to partner with communities to ask questions and to address questions. And then from an action research perspective, I also like to work on those issues. So to me, research isn't just about collecting data and understanding and answering questions, but it's also about taking what we learn and taking what we know and then doing something about it. So I've worked with children on climate change and doing community work, and I often combine the arts and the sciences in the work that I do. So I did my undergrad in the arts, and I like to integrate those.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Petrin?
Thank you again for everyone showing up. I think of the people today, I'm a bit of a newbie in terms of the community engagement and really trying to figure out how to do it from my perspective. I first encountered it in the study of invasive species, where we were getting such valuable information from the public about where species are and where they occur and how they get around. And I realized that's information we would never get another way. And with the advent of things like iNaturalist, which I am a huge proponent of, where the citizens can participate, and it's pretty darn good. But recent efforts to working across disciplinary boundaries to say, how can we, and the theme here is urban ecology that we've been working on recently, how can we, the scientific community and social scientists and from a wide, diverse background, how can we reach out and partner and truly partner with the community? And there are so many groups locally that are working in the environment and trying to restore habitats and things like that. And the model that I've used was the Cincinnati project. I had a front row seat as the Cincinnati project got up and running, and I supported it a lot. And I learned a lot about how to, and I'm not saying I'm an expert at it, but I believe in it. Working with the community to even form your first questions. Like, what is the question? What is the research that needs to be done? Going in without that presumption of knowing what you should do. And that, to me, is the most valuable aspect of trying to get that to occur in different fields, like environmental science.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I recently made my first observation on iNaturalist, and I was very nervous how it would go, but it turned out okay. So I was happy about that. Great. Thank you all so much. So I'd like to start us off with a question. So you're all faculty members working primarily in a university setting, and I imagine that talking to stakeholders outside of the academy maybe requires a different sort of approach than you would take with those inside the academy. So I'd be interested to hear about ways of communicating that you found successful, especially in terms of identifying common interests with community stakeholders and building up, specific shared research goals based on those shared interests, right? And if you could say a bit about how your specific fields, since you all work in quite different fields, have influenced your approach, that would be really great to hear about as well.
I can start us off if that's okay. I think for me, as a sociologist who studies structure, power, race, and racism, that has really oriented how I understand my positionality in communities, in the field, in communities. I also think, it would be disingenuous to discount the fact that I also hold a marginalized identity, and the vast majority of the communities that I am hoping to partner with are also marginalized communities. And so in this sort of weird way, I have a little bit of street cred going in that sort of affords me different opportunities than folks who don't necessarily look like me. Now, that's also, it's a blessing, but it's also a risk, right? Because I am still associated with the university. And so there is this very delicate balance that has to be sort of done to ensure that folks understand very clearly that I see them as partners. And so thinking about the ways in which we communicate when we enter in communities is we enter with a very collaborative consensus building platform, right? And so it's not, I'm coming to say what's wrong in your community. It's I'm coming to be of service to your community. And so as we are partnering with communities, it's not just to get data and making clear on the front end that that is not our primary purpose. And whatever data that we do get, we want it to be driven by them so that when we're gone, they can have this information and do with it and use it in ways that feel useful to them. And so I think if I sort of had to list the top things you need to be thinking about, is it's clarity for you and your team about why you are there. Because if you don't have clarity, you won't be able to clearly articulate it. So having clarity amongst yourself in terms of a team about why you're there and the ability to communicate that to the community that you're going to, and complete transparency. And that one is a continuing process, because you might go in with, sort of one set of ideas and assumptions, but as you learn things, that changes, right? And so it's important to communicate those changes if it's changes about how you're thinking about things with that community. And so honesty, transparency, collaboration, and consensus building to me are sort of the benchmarks.
I am happy to build on that. I agree with everything that Letitia was just saying. And I think, coming from a social science perspective, being in psychology, I just want to say, I think sometimes it's easier to talk about the work than maybe doing some of the translation that scientists have to do. So I've been in this kind of middle space in some ways, straddling the sciences and social sciences, because I'm doing this environmental work that sometimes it involves sort of an educational component, related to climate change and bringing it home and thinking about what we're thinking about locally and here and now and everything. But that when we're talking about collaborating with community members and doing kind of people-focused work, sometimes it's less technical. It involves a little bit less translation than some of the harder sciences. And so I think I've been in it's a little bit of a special situation where the collaborations that I've had in communities have come to me as opposed to reaching out and trying to establish myself in the community, or go to places and develop trust and relationships that grow into things. And so where those partnerships have come from have actually been from doing things not dissimilar to this. So kind of being around and doing public events and panels and being around in the community and being seen and kind of understood for the work that you do. And that makes it so much easier, I think, in some ways, especially when you want to work with people to answer questions that they have, to have relationships sort of start from that direction. And so I think what Letitia was saying about transparency and open honesty and everything in the research process is really important once those relationships are established.
Yeah, if I would add one more thing along the same trajectory that you guys laid out, it's time. It takes time, and you have to be ready to make a commitment somehow. just show up and listen. And that takes a lot of time. I'm doing like a natural experiment in this environmental community. It's been 18 months. And I'm helping out where I can, and we're talking about how to build a connection between our students and the curriculum and some of these groups. But I didn't have an idea of exactly how to do this going in. It just has to happen kind of naturally, like Carly said. It has to be a point at which people come to you and now recognize, hey, could you do this, or could this work? And it really does take time. So in some sense, it's great to have some administrative help or something that can, so that each individual person at a university doesn't necessarily have to put in all the time on their own. So some structure, I think, really can help if that can be had.
And Amanda, I know you have more questions, but I think Ken sort of teed me up as if we kind of planned this, because I feel like this is sort of a perfect plug for the Cincinnati Project, thinking about the ways in which we do community partnered work with the Cincinnati Project, right? We have community partners who know who know TCP, who know the reputation of the researchers related to and affiliated with TCP. And so as they are trying to tackle questions or problems in their community, or innovation even, because it's not always a question or a problem, it's sometimes innovation. They have innovative things they want to do in their communities. They know that TCP is a place where they can come and people will be there to sort of help them work through the innovation or the questions that they have. And so I think that is one of the reasons why something like TCP, what Ken and Carly both said, this structure, knowing where to go for communities, that's why TCP is so important.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And, we have a lot of local people in the audience, which is great. They can make use of that resource. That just made me think of a question really quick. If you have any sort of thoughts or recommendations on how people in other communities can find their local version of the Cincinnati Project, right? Like, where should they look to find these kinds of projects to get involved? And if you've found any specific ways of getting the word out about the Cincinnati Project that have been especially successful in reaching certain audiences, for example, if anyone has any thoughts on that, that would be great to hear about.
So I think I'm just going to say a lot of stuff, and some of it may answer your question, but I know we're in a time limit, so I'm going to try not to say as much stuff as sort of swirling in my mind. And so I think one of the sort of roadblocks to this kind of work is financial investment in that work, right? And so shout out to Ken when he was Dean of Arts and Sciences, and now our current Dean, Valerio Ferme, who are supporting the work of TCP in very strained financial times, right? There's only so many resources in a super tight budget environment to lend to this work, right? And so then that requires the scientists who are working with TCP to be writing grants, but they're doing that on top of the other work that they're doing, right? And so we're creating all of this increased work that we're all doing because we believe in the greater good of the community-based work, of having communities participate in the generation of knowledge and science. And so that is really a barrier, right? And so I think I'm saying all of that to say these things do exist at other institutions in other cities, but they're often really hard to find because they're often understaffed and underfunded and working off of the goodwill of scientists who deeply are committed to collaborative generation of science and knowledge. And so sometimes it's really hard to locate these things.
So our next question is a bit related. This is Dan Hicks' question, who asks, I'm a relatively new assistant professor. I'd like to work towards some community-based research projects. Obviously, it's difficult, especially at this time, to get those sorts of things going. Do you have any advice for someone in that situation, how to sort of really get started at the very beginning stages of wanting to do this kind of work in a new place, especially?
So I'll just say, being new is one kind of context. Being in COVID is another kind of context. So maybe we could talk about those like one in turn. Doing community-based research in the current context is really, really difficult, especially establishing relationships. We don't know what the future holds, but it's hard to kind of be getting to know people in a virtual format like this. And so if anybody finds the solutions to these problems, let me know, because I think we're all just kind of fatigued from this kind of engagement. And so there's that. As far as getting involved in community-based work initially, to me, that kind of question somewhat depends on the context. To me, it depends a little bit on what you're thinking about, what your background is, where you're coming from, the problems that you're working on, or the discipline that you're coming from. But I think one thing I would say first is, if there's something that's going on in your region that is in that world, whatever you want to do, look into what that is already. What's going on already? Can you plug into that somehow? Because I think a lot of times people think about getting involved in the community and kind of doing their own thing. And I think in a way that kind of comes from academia, the way it's so individualistic, like we run our own research labs, or we like have our own research programs. But when it comes to community work, that's really collective. It's very collaborative, and and when it comes to certain kind of social and environmental problems, you can be sure pretty much that people are starting to work on those problems around you. There's organizations and things like that. So maybe figure out what that is, and see if there's a role for you.
Yeah, Ken, did you want to add on to?
I would just echo that exactly, because I think people can put a lot of time and a lot of effort in, and in the end, maybe their project shifts. The impact is not as great as maybe it could be, and it's often not sustainable. So if you can join in with a group that maybe has a little presence, or even just one other individual that has a bit of a presence in some community, that could be a really big help. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's something that I found at the University of Minnesota. There are a ton of institutions and collectives and so on that do really interesting community engaged work. And it seems like there's connections between them all, but just trying to get people in one place right now is I think really difficult. But I think maybe just like finding where those links are and bookmarking them for later at this point is a good way to start. We have a question in the chat from Allison Wiley, who asks, how did you all convince University of Cincinnati to create, host, and support the Cincinnati project? I asked because I've seen institution-initiated units that are meant to facilitate community outreach / community-based participatory research, but end up serving mainly a gatekeeping role.
So I kind of feel weird trying to answer this question, because maybe Ken should really answer it. And I think the answer is not going to be really fulfilling, Allison. I mean, Ken, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the answer is we had a really well thought out project and a dean and an associate dean at the time who had the power to say, this is a good idea, let's implement it, right? Now, had Dr. Mallett not been the associate dean and Dean Petra had not been the dean at the time, would it have happened? Maybe not. I don't know. But it was sort of like all odds were in our favor. The people who had to say yes were in the positions to support the project. And that's what happened. And it bore fruit. So the successor in the dean's office also felt compelled to support it, right? So it wasn't just like, these crazy kids have an idea.
Yeah, I would think approach this like you might ask an administrator for a period of time for some modest support, a startup kind of thing. And then after a couple or 3 years, then you reassess. And it could be pretty minor. It could be just support for some student assistant, like grad student assistantship or something that is not a huge lift for an administrator all the time. And and then see what grows from it and assess along the way. And the case was I thought so compelling from the start. I thought we have to see where this can go. So having that good case of understanding that there's a period of time to build relationships, I thought was a really great insight that, from my perspective in my disciplines, I hadn't heard that as much.
So we have a sort of a joint question from Eduardo and Sarah in the chat. So Eduardo asks, I would be interested in hearing about situations where our panelists have encountered disagreements, or perhaps were worried about them, among their community partners or community members with whom they are collaborating. How did you go about engaging with stakeholders that disagree? And Sarah asks, in a similar vein, can you all speak to things that have gone wrong in community engaged work and how you worked things out? I think sometimes a good way to help convince others is to recognize the imperfections and challenges in addition to all the amazing benefits.
As the young people say, I'm trying to decide how much tea do we spill here today. Oh, gosh. This work is not without challenges. I think sort of for me personally, the most trying challenge that I had was community members disagreeing with each other and coming to independent conclusions about whose side I was on, and then sort of jockeying for power and reading sort of my position as being on a particular side. That was then causing lots of division and really impacting both my sort of intellectual work as a researcher, but hampering the progress of the community as well. And I would be lying if I say I know that it got completely sorted out. I don't know that it did. We did reach a place where folks were at least behaving themselves. And part of that was sort of having a moment where everyone had to be pulled into a room. And I had to say, like, I am a neutral party. I just want to do this work and I want to do it collaboratively, and I can't do it without you and I can't do it without you. And so do we even want to still do this work together anymore? But I don't know that I can say it was solved.
I think in my fields, the struggle is often on the side of the scientists. We are not naturally, these fields of ecology, evolution and stuff are not naturally community engaged, at least historically. So crossing over and sharing in the planning and the questions, that's new for a lot of people, and it's uncomfortable because we're used to saying, this is my question, I want to go here and I'll work with you to figure it out. Well, that's not quite what we're talking about. And even in the field of urban ecology, it's pretty recent to talk about fundamental community engagement. And so you have to find the kind of scientists that are willing to think of things that are not what maybe they would choose to do first, or think of even methods and things that might not be up to their standards, because there's the opportunities are for the kinds of data and the ways that we can partner can't really involve such a Herculean effort to quantify things to the nth degree. You can't, it's not going to work if you spend a year to identify a jar full of bugs. Like, it just, so you have to find other ways to make it happen, with students at a slightly different level. It's still absolutely valid, but it's not where we would normally go. So that to me is I think one of the harder things, to find that sweet spot between these different communities.
Yeah, so I'll add to that. I think, my mind's been everywhere. I've been listening, but also kind of thinking about, like, what are some of the key kind of issues or challenges in community work that I've come across. And I think mine is sort of talking about challenges, but in a more, I'll make a recommendation kind of way. And that is, in community work, things don't always go as planned. So it's messy, it's, unpredictable, and it's, it can be challenging. So expect that. And if you are trying to follow a particular agenda or timeline, and you have the capability of doing this, build flexibility into what you're doing, because things will change. They will need to be updated. You will need to skip things or change directions. And what can be difficult about this is that a lot of the academic structures that we're working in actually want you to have those plans already, and they want you to be able to stick to things. So this goes with, in human subjects, social science research, we do IRB, Institutional Review Board Ethics Review, and they want to know everything you're doing. Funding proposals want to know everything you're doing. Dissertation committees want to know everything you're doing. And this can make it really hard, because when you go and you work with communities, all of a sudden you're off script, and it's really challenging. So what I would recommend is that in advance, if you can, in any way possible, just kind of write about or plan for the fact that there's going to be some variation around this theme. Because especially if you're doing participatory style work, you might be making decisions together, consulting with groups, and planning and doing things collectively. And then on the other hand, if it's not totally participatory, but you have a plan and you're kind of coming in and you really want to do this and check this box, then it's, just know that you're probably going to end up having to deviate around that at least a little bit sometimes with communities.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that, there is the struggle sort of comes from these unexpected aspects of doing this kind of work, which is a good thing, because obviously, we want to remain flexible and learn in the moment, but maybe that's something that sort of the academy more broadly needs to address, is that it's not going to be possible to write in exactly each step of the process. There's no precise formula for doing this kind of work, especially successfully, right? Having a final project that accomplishes what it set out to accomplish. So it's interesting to hear from all of you that that's sort of a central guiding thought in doing this kind of work successfully. So we have a story here from Arnie Miller, who says, many years ago, I worked at a marine field station in St. Croix that ultimately closed down after it was badly damaged in a hurricane. It seems like the station was thriving before the hurricane, but there wasn't a groundswell of community support in the hurricane's aftermath for rebuilding the lab. Arnie says, in retrospect, I think this was because the field station was seen as isolated from the broader community on St. Croix and the challenges of that community, and is wondering how we sort of make changes on a grand scale so that at least for community-based projects in Cincinnati, for the Cincinnati project, there's that sense of staying engaged with the community as a welcoming partner, Arnie says. If we have any thoughts on how to avoid those sorts of situations.
I think the partnering, true partnering to help the community answer some of the questions that they have, and this could be individuals, but it could be other community organizations, right? Just to make that clear. That's key, right? I mean, if we can find ways to bring whatever UC offers to help answer some questions that they really want to know, I think that is a key way to bring to help build that relationship and make it kind of mutually sustaining. But that is a really great question, and that is what we're thinking about. But it also is something that takes a fair bit of time because it's all not set up. Like setting this, and that leads into the next question, which I'm sure you'll mention, but how do we make this work in the UC environment?
So I think what I might add to that is sort of an ugly truth of the academy, and, my context is UC, but it's not unique to UC. We say we care about public engagement with science. We say we care about community participatory research, but the ways in which we show we value things in the academy is promote people for the work. And when I say promote, I'm talking about things like RPT, pay people merit pay for the work. And we know that very few reappointment, promotion, and tenure documents speak to this kind of work, and hence it's not valued. And so people have to make decisions. I'm an assistant professor. I'm deeply committed to community-based research, but it takes years to do that. I need to have X amount of publications and X amount of research dollars. And so then I'm not going to do that. How much intellectual knowledge are we cutting off from communities and from the academy by not truly valuing this work? And we can't say we value a thing, but not document the ways in which we reward it. And so I think that this is a much larger systematic issue for the academy to really contend with. If we really see the creation of science as collaborative, the dissemination of public knowledge as a good, then we would value those things in our policies, processes, and procedures. And we, generally speaking, do not. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing, and again, this is sort of UC specific, but I'm certain given that we have tons of large urban institutions, this is not specific to UC. We really have to be honest and contend with our reputation in the communities, right? And so I'm going to keep on coming back to the Cincinnati project. One of the reasons why the Cincinnati project has had so much success is because those that are at the helm of that organization and who have been since its inception had reputations in the community outside of the institution. And so when folks see me, they know I'm affiliated with the University of Cincinnati, but that's not the first sort of salient thing they remember or recognize about my identity. And so it separates me from sort of the trauma and the violence that folks have experienced in their communities as a result of institutions, right? And so I think until we're willing to be frank and honest about our reputations as institutions, academies of higher learning, UC and other universities, we're going to find ourselves sort of at a stalemate, making small little progress, doing small little fits of public good, but whole scale, I don't think we'll get there doing what we're doing.
I have a little bit to add, and I completely agree with everything that's already been said. So I was trying to make sense of this, the LaCroix, the St. Croix example of that about this hurricane that happened and what happened since. And I'm not sure if I'm kind of understanding it correctly, but it sounds like it wasn't rebuilt, and maybe that was because it was not, something that people felt that they had ownership over, or maybe it wasn't prioritized in the community or something like that. I don't, but in any case, what it seems to me is that a couple of things. First, if we want things to last in a community setting, and we really want to have that kind of impact that endures over time, or projects to sustain themselves, that's why partnering, I think, with communities makes sense throughout the process, to build that sense of ownership and to, watch things flourish without the continued participation of people at UC if we're trying to really build things. And so working alongside community members and maybe even thinking about watching that grow and continue beyond your own involvement is a goal. Of course, that doesn't really relate to every kind of project that's out there. But the second kind of theme that was in my mind was this idea of projects. And I think as researchers and academics, a lot of the times we think of the work that we do in terms of projects, like it starts and it ends. But in community work, I think it's it's more of a relationship. You're developing relationships with people. They're not one and done projects. And I think part of the reason why universities have these legacies of showing up and doing something and putting something in place and then going away and leaving it there, and then it rusts or, falls apart or whatever it is it's because of the one and done idea, that we kind of go and do our thing and we get the data and then we leave. If it's possible to do this in your community relationships, is to kind of think about this as something that endures over time. What are we doing together? Could we think about it in cycles or phases? And can we build on the work that we've done in order to continue doing it over time, whatever that looks like? And in the work that I've done in the past, in order to break out of this sort of project mode, is to think about when you're making decisions together as a team, maybe building on the findings that you have to do something in another phase and so on, and think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to keep in mind, is that, a lot of times these community-based research projects are just sort of formulated in a standard research sort of paradigm where, you have goals you want to meet and that's what the project accomplishes. But I think this, more sort of like a refocusing on it as a relationship is really valuable, especially for early career people who want to get involved in this sort of thing, but might not be around for that long to be able to keep that relationship going. Having some sort of mediary to serve as the point at which that relationship persists over time, and working through that, I think that's a really important thing, maybe for the institution or the university to provide and support over time, right? So we have a question that I think came out of a comment from Dr. Petrin. Sarah Goring wants to know, do you think that there are ways to do training for next generation scientists so that they take community engaged practice as a paradigm?
Absolutely. And, in some fields it's kind of built in, but in a lot of fields it's not. I think those are opportunities. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do now with Steve Motter and a couple others are trying to figure out how can we create these kinds of science courses in our curriculum that gives the students experiences doing research, but in partnership with community partners. And, there may be some models out there for how to do it. You hear of a little bit here and there, but in a lot of fields there's not good models. Another question was, how do you sustain this over the university time span where everything is a course in a semester, right? So we're trying to build components across different semesters, starting with training to a certain level, and then get the students to dig in on projects, have those projects generate data that will build over time, which is not too hard to do with environmental kinds of data. But again, choosing what to build in collaboration with the partners, right? So we could imagine ways to go that are not going to be as relevant. And so we're at this phase now of how do we make it work where you can get the students to collect something meaningful in a short period of time that contributes to a larger continuous effort. And it's not easy. And I'm actually going outside of my field even to figure out how, I'm not a stream ecologist, but that's one of the things that's needed. So I'm becoming a stream ecologist to try to get this to work. And that's kind of what's needed at first. And maybe if we learn a little bit, then we could say, okay, these kinds of people will fit in. If we hire them down the road, will really fit into this plan very well. And that's a little plus for bringing those kinds of people in.
Oh, I'll just add really quick because we have a question that builds off of that as well. This point about timescales is really important in trying to find a way to sort of fit in research for everyone that's going to benefit, of course, not only the students who are working on these projects, but also obviously the community members for whom the research is really valuable to their everyday lives. So Evelyn Brister asks if you could talk a bit about these timescales, and you mentioned, the academic calendar, and also asks, have you had to change your expectation for the pace at which things develop as a result of this sort of work?
I would like to sort of pick up a little bit where I left off in order to answer that question, because something that was sort of remaining in my mind was this idea of the structures that we're functioning in and how those can allow or disallow this type of work. So I'm speaking from from idealism about what this stuff could look like. So when I'm talking about these relationships lasting over time and doing phases of projects and everything, that's an ideal scenario. It's sort of something to aspire to. But we're operating in institutions and structures that are asking us to do projects, right? And we're and to fund projects, right? So funding is about getting this done in X amount of time and with these deliverables and so on. And so it's kind of being asked to straddle these two things at the same time. So that brings us to timescales. And I was thinking about students and how it can be hard for students who are doing degree earning projects to think about their work in terms of relationships rather than projects. And so it's not always possible to do this kind of stuff. And I think what Ken was talking about in a way was just making me think about how much right now what we are talking about requires scientists who are committed to this, who really are passionate about this kind of work, because of what Letitia was talking about earlier, which is that we aren't really incentivizing this kind of work by institutionalizing and incentivizing it in some of our most important ways, like RPT and promotion and so on. And so in order to develop, produce scientists, students who are graduating who have this commitment to doing community engaged science and research, it's right now we're asking that professors who are training students are learning about this and conveying that to students and so on, when I think it should probably be something that's done at the program level that, is a part of our training programs, is something that we're expecting of our students and demonstrating that we value as a university, right, through the design of the training that we do.
I think if I would add to that, I think, as Carly has said, and I think Kim mentioned it too, we got to change our pace, mostly because if we remember, we are sort of guests in communities. And so their pace becomes our pace, and we have to know that going in, right? I also think that the timescale issue varies depending on the kind of collaborative community work you're doing, right? And so I'm thinking about some of the projects that we have done through the Cincinnati project that have actually been projects, right? They had a start and a finish because they had an outcome. Probably our most famous, if you will, project or most successful is our eviction study that actually made its way to Cincinnati City Council and resulted in legislation being passed. That was sort of a start and a finish one, right? And so the timescales on that one was much more different than some of the other much longer term projects that we're working on. And so I don't want to be, I think there is a way to sort of do this work in a way that benefits the community, but also allows the researcher to have those products that they need. I think it is a delicate balance. And so you have to really be delicate with that. But I don't want to make it seem like, oh, you can't do community-based research until you are a full professor, right? We have Carly, who is very wildly successful in the work that she's doing, but she's also deeply committed to it, right? So it's this super delicate balance, and you have to really understand what you are walking into when you walk into this particular methodological framework.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, we don't want to discourage people from pursuing this sort of work until they get tenure, because, obviously that's not going to be the best outcome really for everyone. But at the same time, those structures need to be in place to support students along the way, and, to make sure that the projects do actually amount to something for people. And that made me think as well, in terms of projects that do have this sort of specific end goal, in terms of how they impact the community, especially. I'm wondering if any of you could share your experiences or thoughts in general on successful ways of sort of following up with communities to make sure that they get that information about what happened as a result of this research, so they aren't just left to wonder, was any change made? Like, how is this going to impact me in the long term? If you have any specific examples to share, that would be great to hear about.
I can jump in here. I think sort of my gold standard is anything that I produce, it needs to be readable to the communities that I'm working with, right? I come from a family where I am first generation. And so if my mother can't read it, it's not well written. And so I think that is another thing that we need to be thinking about as collaborative community partnered research. Are we producing written knowledge in a way that is accessible to the very people we're collaborating with, right? And so anything that I produce that is part of work that I am doing with communities, it is accessible and they get the first copy, if you will. It's not like they will see it when it comes out in the paper. And I think that is the gold standard. And it should be, because that's how you continue to cultivate those relationships, right? So what you do when you're done will impact if you ever get to do it again. Because even if communities are not next door to each other, communities are having conversations with one another about their interactions and relationships with institutions. And so what you do with what you produce will impact if you ever get to do it again.
Just to add to that, I would say that, when we think about what comes out of what is our work kind of building towards, a lot of the times we're, be trained to think in terms of publications, academic publications of various sorts. I've seen in community work so many different possibilities for types of community dissemination. So this could be a report that, summarizes findings in an accessible way, is something that is a written document that kind of talks about the findings from the project. But we don't have to think about it in terms of a document at all. So, I mean, I've seen websites created that turn into tools that are open access, for community members, that, mapping different layers of things and finding out things about your community, or films and different ways of sort of art forms and to communicate findings. So, young people can put together videos and things like that and actually have a community event and do a screening. You can think about all kinds of different formats for sharing these things, but especially kind of getting together and having a real-time kind of event to share findings can be useful as well, and to be able to ask and address questions and share resources that way.
That's great. I love the idea of an art exhibit to round up all of everyone involved and all of the results. And indeed, Dr. Bates mentions in the chat here that's a nod to the TCP traveling exhibit, which we saw in a previous presentation. That was really great. Very cool to see. Dr. Petchen, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add on to that before we move to the next question? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I just spent a good chunk of this week distilling down some scientific studies and in collaboration with our partners, in this case, Great Parks of Hamilton County. They do these prairie restorations, and they do these dramatic controlled burns, and we're hoping to help them study the ecology of that, and also what the students produced, and summarizing that in a way that communicates to them, and then giving them a draft of the poster and getting edits back, right? So because they're concerned with public dissemination, and that's what this is. And just the fact, I realized that just the fact that they had edits means we're getting closer to their perspective, right? Like, because other scientific posters, you wouldn't have a chance of someone giving you any edits. And we could easily do posters like that, and we do, right, for other contexts. So it's a very different thing trying to communicate to these folks, and it's something that I think we all have to work on, because it's not always so easy. But someone mentioned, is this a paradigm for the students? Absolutely. This is a wonderful thing to build into our upper level classes and capstones. And, how do you communicate to these kinds of partners? We'll teach them real science, but how do you cross over and talk about it to this audience in a way that helps guide them, makes it useful to them somehow?
I think, Ken, if I can add on to that, one of the amazing things about this movement, because I really do think it's a movement in this moment, one of the great things about this movement is that we'll now have a generation of scholars that will be their baseline, right? Like, that is so powerful to me, that they will understand their work is only so important if they can communicate it to a diverse audience. The impact of that, I don't know if we'll see it in our lifetimes, but it is setting a new baseline for what it means to be a scientist that can communicate. And so I imagine, again, I don't know if this is, like Carly said, in my sort of ideal world, that now we're training a generation of scientists that this will be their baseline. So then the scientists that they will train, that will be their baseline, and the legacy will go on and on and on. And for me, that's the underpinning of this movement that we're in right now, this public engagement with science, this collaborative creation of knowledge and science. That is what makes this so magnificent to me. It's not what we're doing in this moment, but sort of what we are contributing to that will live on well beyond any of us.
Yeah, that's really great to see that there's already changes being made that will hopefully have this lasting impact on really kind of all the fields that can do this sort of work. So we have a question from Angela, who asks, each of the panelists has mentioned their fields, sociology, psychology, and biology, and the natural/social science divide. I'm wondering if you could each tell us what you see as hallmark features of the approaches to involving communities in your research within your field, or put another way, what your field in particular has to offer community-based research.
I'll start with so psychology has a number of subdisciplines, so, when people think of psychology, that sometimes they think about clinical psychology, getting into psychotherapy, things like that. And then you have the behavioral scientists and the lab coats and all that kind of stuff. Well, in the range of psychology disciplines, I was trained in social psychology or applied social psychology. And that the tradition there in terms of community engagement wasn't necessarily what I ended up doing. What I ended up doing was affiliated with the subdiscipline called community psychology, which is very small and not well known, but it is probably the most exciting, transformative, collaborative kind of discipline for doing actual social change work in communities. And so that's what I gravitated towards. And that whole discipline, rather than being sort of what does that discipline contribute in terms of community engaged work. That's what that whole discipline is about. And so it's the principles have to do with engaging with communities on their own terms and making decisions together and being transparent and building something that lasts and all of that stuff. I mean, when I'm going through all of these ideals, I'm thinking about community psychology principles and practices. So I discovered this field of community psychology as a graduate student in, again, a social psychology program, and was trying to kind of balance that with my own dissertation research, where I didn't just want to apply the psychology findings that had been generated in the past into a community setting and watch that in terms of outcomes and sort of like a plug-in and sort of a top-down approach. I wanted to do the collaborative bottom-up kind of stuff. And so I had to be reminded from time to time that you're not in a community psychology graduate program. So that was hard because it was a little bit of tension between different subdisciplines. But I think I'm losing track of what the question was, but community psychology is a great resource. So if anybody is looking at, what are the principles of doing community engaged type of work, there's a lot of wisdom from within the field of community psychology if you Google it and look into it.
I think for me as a sociologist, really the underpinnings of the discipline of sociology is about understanding communities and really being attuned to how inequality is created and perpetuated over time. And so as a sociologist, I always see sort of the discipline as the average man's science, if you will, right? And so there are lots of things that we do and pontificate about in sociology that directly helps folks make sense of the experiences that they're having. And so I'm thinking about sort of all the things that are happening in our world right now and the ways in which the common man or woman or person, if you will, is trying to make sense of systematic issues around racism or homophobia, transphobia, all of these things. Sociology is sort of the place where we can go to get those answers. And so I think in a lot of ways, sociology brings a comfort to this community-based research because we sit with communities and give them the opportunity to be able to name the experiences that they're having, right? And so I know that I'm always talked over in my meetings, or I know that I'm always followed in my local grocery store, or I know that my local grocery store produce costs way more than the one across town, but I don't really know what to call that, right? And so when you partner sociologists with communities, we can tell you live in a food desert or you live in a community that is underdeveloped and undervalued, right? And so I think comforting communities by equipping them with the language to both validate and name the experiences that they're having is one of the great rewards of being a sociologist participating in this work, because people are often left to feel like, is this just my experience, right? But then you get a lot of people in the room and you tell them like, there's actually a name for that thing. It's called microaggressions. It's called systematic racism. Then folks start to be able to take ownership of talking about the ways in which they're experiencing the society that they're moving their way through. And so I think I'm also sort of losing sight of the question, but I think for me, that is what sort of equips me as a sociologist. And I think to do this kind of work, and what I think is sort of the benefit of being a sociologist. I am very much reflective of my power and privilege and positionality in communities because we're trained to think about those things very intentionally.
Yeah, and in the environmental realm, it's pretty clear to see, like, for instance, environmental science has a very close relationship with the community and a lot of issues. It sits on top of many other disciplines. And there's not always a strong connection between those disciplines and the practice of environmental science. And, and more groups are turning or understanding and trying to find ways to better manage the environment. And they're not always geared to taking a scientific approach to do that. I mean, there are practices, like they've used a best practice kind of approach, but not necessarily a, hey, let's study this to see the outcome kind of approach. And this is debatable. Other environmental scientists might say, oh, you're wrong. So I'll acknowledge that. But I do think there are a lot more opportunities to connect the science with the community than is currently happening. And I think a lot of people see that, almost putting the power of science into the hands of the people and not just in the hands of the academics, which I think is a really good idea.
Yeah, that reminds me of a comment from Dr. Honda in our last session, that science is something we all do every day. I really enjoyed that, and I thought that that's very much true, and something that if we point out to people, you're engaging in science and like everything that you do, you are a scientist, and you're very much in this way. I think that's really powerful. So I've got one last question here. I think we've got time for one more. I'm just wondering if you could all share some of the more sort of like practical details in terms of the ways that you've developed partnerships with community stakeholders. If you could share your own experience and what's worked for you, and sort of directly reaching out to people, or working with particular entities that have been successful in reaching out to people, that would be great to hear about.
I'm kind of new at this. I'm right in the middle of building a lot of this, so I'll kind of defer to the others who have a little more experience.
I've mostly drawn on my networks. And so, again, this is a little bit tricky for me because I enter communities mostly not as a researcher, but as sort of a member of communities, right? And so my philanthropic involvement in other civic organizations, my historically Black sorority, my church group. And so it's really sort of tricky for me to answer that question, because I have sort of had access points that others may not necessarily have because of my civic engagement just in general. But I think networks and networking is probably one thing that I would say, that regardless of your sort of involvement in communities in general, it's about networking. Do you know someone who is in that community? How immersed have you yourself become in that community, right? And so are you really making connections by, I don't know, going to the community council meetings, for example? How are you showing up in those communities are going to impact if folks see you as someone who they want to be involved with. And so I think that's sort of the first step. I had said earlier, and I think both Carly and Ken alluded to this, like, what's your reason for being there? And how do you sort of integrate yourself or start to integrate yourself into that community and show up for and in that community in a way that helps to facilitate some of that bridge building between you and the community? Absolutely.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. And I said earlier that I've had the fortunate situation of having partnerships come to me. And I think that's just to emphasize something that Letitia just said, that it's kind of just about being present. So if you show up to places and you're in the kinds of spaces that are associated with the work that you would like to do, it's possible that will turn into something, whether it's a collaboration or somebody comes to you and says, is this the kind of work? And I would say take any opportunity that you have to share the previous work that you've done, to be a public-facing scholar that is, demonstrating that this is the kind of work that you do in the area that you work on, and so on, because it's a way of being visible for what you do, and maybe relationships will come from that. The only other thing I would add is something that I mentioned before about understanding what's going on in your area related to that particular thing, so that when it comes time to be collaborating on those issues, you're building yourself into an infrastructure that probably already exists to some extent.
Amanda, can I say one last thing? Because something Carly said made me just think of this. I think it's also important too to be either willing to pivot or willing to give the project to someone else. Because showing up in spaces sometimes may mean that people bring projects to you, that's not your area of expertise, right? And so you have to be honest about what your skill set is. If you need somebody that does, I forget what it's called, but it's a methodology where you take pictures. Photo ethnography, I think is what it might be called. Thank you. If I don't do that, so if someone, even if I have a close partnership, comes to me and says that, I don't do that. I will point them to my colleague, Dana Harley over in Allied Health. She does that. That is the foundation of what she does. And so also as a researcher, being honest about your skill set, that will get you a lot of goodwill. Like, I would really love to partner with you, but that's not my bag. But I know someone who it is. And you can be tangentially related to the project as sort of a facilitator of networks, but you don't have to be the person that carries that project out.
Yeah, I think that's a really great sort of takeaway overall, is that, sort of starting with those relationships is really crucial, and seeing what you can bring to the table. And if it's not quite right, then making another connection with somebody else who can, and letting the project sort of naturally flow from there. That's a really nice observation. And I think that really sort of speaks to the whole session of scientific work with communities. Great. Okay. So that puts us exactly at time to finish up. Dr. Petrin, do you have any last thoughts you wanted to add in on that, or we're all set?
No, I'm glad that point was mentioned, Letitia, because that was one of the founding principles of the Cincinnati project when it was presented to me, of, being a portal. And UC has so much going on in the community, but there are too many portals. There's too many individuals. So it's not easy to find if you're on the outside. So the more that an entity like TCP, or now perhaps this, the field center, could act as a portal, that is, I think, fundamental to helping this, the reputation of UC in the community.
Yeah, great. Okay, so let's thank all of our panelists for this excellent discussion. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing everything that you've learned with us. It's been really great to hear from you. And thank you to all of our attendees for sticking with us through this beautiful Friday afternoon. And we are excited to continue next Friday with our discussion on philosophical work that can be done in this realm. So thank you all again, and hopefully see you next Friday.